Hi there, this is Skycave Studios. Let's get right into it. My illustration process can be broken down into 10 simple steps. So I use this exact same process for my bigger illustrations, but for this tutorial, we're going to be drawing a simple character like this. The first step is the setup. We want to get everything situated to make sure we have the most efficient, easy, and honestly enjoyable time illustrating. So I'll be using Procreate on the iPad for this, but this is not a Procreate tutorial. So there are a few things to look out for regardless of what program you're using. First, I like to make my canvas size at least 4K resolution, so all of my exports are high quality. Next, you only need one brush for this style. Don't worry about trying to find the perfect brush, it really doesn't matter. Mine is just a simple brush with slightly roughened edges. Here's what it looks like if you are interested. Just make sure the brush you choose isn't transparent or you'll have some odd overlapping on your line art. Lastly, and this might be the most important thing, make sure that you use the same sized brush for the entire illustration. I'm just going to use a thin brush for this entire process, and once you've settled on a size you like, write down the brush size, save your brush, take a screenshot, whatever works for you. In Procreate, you can bookmark your brush size by clicking the brush slider and hitting the plus icon, and this lets you easily select and snap to your saved sizes. Now let's start drawing. So now we can begin the actual illustration process. We're going to do this by starting to sketch, and the goal here is to roughly get our ideas on paper and focus on shape and composition. So I have a layer called Sketch, and I'm going to just sketch loosely and start to draw out my character. Be nice and loose with your lines, don't worry about tight line art or any type of perfectionism here. Again, we're trying to focus on shape and composition. I'm also choosing to make my character really simple so I don't have to worry too much about anatomy. But if you're struggling with a certain pose or maybe getting your form right, don't hesitate to use references. You can simply take a picture of yourself performing the pose, or you can download some free apps that allow you to pose a character and then just base your sketch off of that. There's one app called MagicPoser that I've been using, and it's really easy to get started with. It just lets you quickly pose a 3D character. Now this character's body is essentially the gingerbread man from Shrek.
You're a monster!
The benefit of having a simple character is the increased speed of which you can complete your artwork. I like to find a nice balance between efficiency and quality when I'm designing a character. I don't want to spend an unnecessary amount of time designing, but I also don't want a character that lacks style or quality. What I'm doing here is flipping my canvas to immediately give me fresh eyes. What this does is it allows you to clearly see the shape and composition with a clear head. Your eyes will play tricks on you after staring at the same thing for a while, and this is such an easy life hack to take advantage of. I used to not do this and my work suffered so much, so I highly recommend it, especially in the sketch phase where shape and composition are so important. Right off the bat, I can see that the arm of my character is much longer than the other arm, so I'm going to fix that. Here I'm creating guides to measure and compare the size of the arms. I was clearly way off, and honestly, I probably wouldn't have noticed that if I didn't flip my canvas. So now I'm adjusting the size of this arm and moving on to the head and face, remembering to flip my canvas to clearly see what I'm doing. Also, don't be afraid to copy and paste elements that are meant to be symmetrical. I actually recommend this because it speeds up your workflow and ensures your shapes are the same. I always do this with eyes, for example. Having two different shapes for eyes can really make your character look wonky. So I'm just finishing up this loose sketch, and it's in a place now where we can move on to the next step. Now we can begin starting the actual line art. Nailing the line art is so incredibly important because, in my opinion, this is where the majority of an illustration style comes from. A lot of beginners or even experienced designers wonder why their art seems to lack style, and a lot of the time, it's because they overlook how powerful treating your line art can be. You can have smooth line art, textured line art, distressed line art, or no line art, and each of those options will drastically affect the style of your illustration. Okay, so I'm going to make a new layer and call it line art, and put it on top of my sketch layer, which I'll use as a reference. I like to make my sketch layer red and lower the transparency to use as a guide for my line art. I'm using a nice deep charcoal color for my line art. You can choose whatever color you want, but I recommend that you save your chosen color so you can easily go back to it as opposed to eyedropping, which can sometimes be inaccurate. Again, I've chosen a thin size for my brush, and for the last time, make sure you use the same size brush for this entire process. I'm sure I sound like a broken record, but it's really going to make your illustration look consistent. So we're essentially just tracing our sketch with very clean lines. This step is incredibly simple, but it can be a little time consuming because you have to commit to the shape you made in the sketch phase. For things like the head, I'm just creating a circle so I don't have to waste time trying to draw a perfect circle like I'm SpongeBob in Squidward's class. Again, I'm just duplicating the pieces that are meant to be symmetrical. Now I'm just finishing this process, remembering the principles we discussed like flipping the canvas. And now we're good to go to the next step. The next step is to begin stylizing the line art. Right now, it's looking basic, it's not very interesting. So I'm going to make a new layer and call it line art detail. Now I'm going to spruce this up by giving the line art a quote unquote hand done look, and I'm going to do this by mimicking ink bleeding onto paper. To achieve that effect, first I'm coloring the corners where the lines join, and this mimics the effect of ink bleeding together. Right here, I decided I wanted to add some texture to his body, so I'm just drawing a few lines to achieve this. But to get that ink bleeding effect, I like to add little ink blots to the end of the lines for that hand-drawn effect. They're just kind of like nodes that go at the end of my lines. The other thing I'm doing is adding some slight variation to the thickness of the line art. So I'm just slightly increasing the thickness here and there. We want to be really subtle here. A little bit goes a long way, and you'd be surprised as to how much more organic this makes your line art look. So I'm going to continue this process for the rest of the drawing. And here's a quick comparison of what the finished result looks like. It's really subtle, but I hope you can see the difference and how it gives our line art that hand-done look. So we've just completed that step. Let's go to the next one. We're going to take a short detour from stylizing our line art and add what I like to call dark shadows. These will represent the darkest shadows cast onto our character. I'm going to be explaining more about lighting a little later, but for now, let's pretend our light source is coming from the top left, meaning our shadows will typically be cast on the right side of our character where the light isn't hitting him. So I'm making a new layer once again and naming it Dark Shadows. Then I'm using the same color as our line art and color blocking where these shadows would generally fall. First I'm doing the head here, which is casting a shadow onto the shoulder, and now I'm adding a dark shadow to the right horn. Although I'm taking some artistic liberty here because the shadow would actually fall lower onto the head. I just think stylistically this looks better. The real reason I create these shadows isn't so much to reflect realistic lighting, but to add contrast to our illustration. It really helps the illustration pop. And with that, we're already moving onward to the next step. There's one more thing we're going to do to push the line art to the next level, and that is distressing the lines to give it a nice vintage, hand-done look. First, I'm going to duplicate my line art layer and name the duplicate Line Art Distressed. Then I'm going to hide the original line art layer, so all we're seeing is our new Line Art Distressed layer. And I'm going to select the eraser tool and make the thickness about the same size as our brush. And I'm simply going to erase little sections of the line art. Immediately you can see that this is adding so much character to our illustration. It honestly feels like cheating because it's such a low effort way to add style. Again, we're going to be subtle with this, so I'll continue to erase these little parts of our line art to distress it, and when I'm done, we can begin to add some color. Finally, we can start incorporating color. I've made a new layer and named it Color, and I'm placing it behind all of our line art layers. We're essentially going to treat this process like a coloring book, coloring and filling inside of our lines. If you're on Procreate, a really fast way to fill in your line art is to tap your original line art layer and choose Reference. This will now tell Procreate to use the artwork on this layer as the boundaries for what you want to fill. So if we simply drag the color onto our color layer, Procreate will respond accordingly. I'm not sure if Photoshop has this ability, but you can simply color in with your brush and it will achieve the same result. So I'm going to start filling in these lines. This step is really self-explanatory and doesn't take much time at all. You can choose whatever colors you like. Again, I'm just using colors that I've saved so I can easily access them. And with that, we have color done. Now we can start with lighting, and we're going to be doing our highlights first. In our dark shadows step, we determined our light source would be in the top left of our illustration. I always choose to put my light source in the top left. There's no real reason why. I've just always done lighting from this angle, but it's really just personal preference. So if the light is striking our character from the top left, then the highlights will almost always be hitting the left sections of our character, while the shadows will reside on the right sections where the light can't reach. So I'm going to create a layer for our light source reference just for the sake of this tutorial, and then I'm going to make another layer for our highlights. And I'm going to put this highlights layer under our line art and dark shadow layers, but above our color layer. I'm choosing a very light yellow color for our highlights. One thing to note is that a light source is very rarely ever white. Light sources almost always have some type of color to it. Even fluorescent lights have a slight blue tint to them, and so for that reason, I rarely use pure white as a highlight color. So I'm starting to draw my highlights, and I like to make my highlights almost triangular and point them in the same direction the light source is traveling. I'm just choosing to put these where I think the light would hit the most. So I'm putting highlights on the horns and definitely on the head, some on the shoulder and the left leg. I'm also putting a small highlight on the right hand and then adding highlights to the eyes. So now we've finished up highlights and we can move on to shadows. We established that light will be hitting the left sections of our character, so we'll put shadows primarily on the right sections of our character. For shadows, I'm going to be using a deep blue, slightly purple color. Again, light sources are rarely white, and similarly shadows are rarely black. I'm going to make a new layer directly under our highlights layer and name it shadows. Now here's a great tip. I set the layer opacity to around 50% and use the hard light blending mode, which will now allow our shadows to react to the colors underneath them. This way, I don't have to do any guesswork as to how the shadows will affect the colors. So I'm adding shading to my illustration, but I'm approaching it differently than my highlights in the sense that I'm not creating these sharp triangular shapes anymore. Instead, I'm going around the contour of my character as if the shadows are nice and soft. I'm also applying more realism to my shadows than I did for my dark shadows, as you can see with the horns here. It's as if they're blocking the light hitting the head of the character. So I'm just going through, adding shading, and paying close attention to detail. I like to even add shadows on the eyes, mouth, hair, and even the textures on the clothing. We're finishing up the shadows, and with that, our character is done. There's just one more quick step. Now we're in the home stretch, and the only thing left to do is take one last look at our character and add some final touches to it. Here, I'm just going to select a nice background that I think fits with the color palette. And then I'm just going to check that the sizing, shape, composition, and everything looks good before calling it complete. I recommend taking this time to do one last canvas flip. And looking at it, I think it's looking great, so we're finally all done. So I genuinely hope that helped and provided some insight. Hopefully you learned something new. Let me know in the comments if you have any questions or requests for more tutorials like this. I plan on doing some more in the future, as well as some time lapses and behind the scenes stuff. So if this video helped you, drop a comment, give it a like, subscribe, only if you want, no pressure. Really the biggest thing is it just lets me know that it's actually useful. I also have an Instagram where you can stay more up to date and where I post my work. Regardless, I really appreciate the support. Thank you for watching, and I hope you have an amazing rest of your day. Take care.